Millionaire mocked his ugly arranged bride, then she took off her disguise. The ballroom gleamed under the golden chandeliers, the opulence a fitting reflection of the wealth Alexander Caldwell had been born into. The grand estate pulsed with life as guests in tailored suits and shimmering gowns floated between conversations, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. Yet, despite the grandeur, Alexander sat alone at the far end of the hall, whiskey swirling in his glass, his jaw set in a hard line. This was supposed to be his engagement party, a celebration of a union he had never desired. An arranged marriage. A medieval relic forced upon him by his parents in the name of business. He scoffed, downing his drink in one bitter gulp. "Alexander," came the polished voice of his father, Charles Caldwell, as he approached with a thin smile. "Try to look pleased. The deal is practically sealed." Alexander's grip tightened around his glass. "You mean the merger, not the marriage." Charles sighed, exasperated. "You know as well as I do that this alliance benefits both families. Evelyn's father has the connections we need in the European market. Their company is drowning, and our investment will save it. It's a win-win. For you, maybe. Not for me." Alexander's voice was low, sharp. "Why do I have to be the bargaining chip?" "Because that's how real business is done, son," Charles replied smoothly. "And you agreed." Alexander had agreed, begrudgingly. Not because he wanted to, but because resistance was futile. His mother had played the emotional card, reminding him of the legacy of the Caldwell name, the weight of their empire. His father had promised autonomy in business if he went through with the marriage. And so, here he was. Engaged to a woman he had never met, a woman who had refused to show her face at their engagement ceremony. A woman who, for reasons unknown, chose to remain veiled. As the night wore on, murmurs spread among the guests. The bride-to-be had arrived. Alexander straightened as the crowd parted, revealing a woman draped in an elegant silver gown. A sheer veil cascaded from the ornate tiara atop her head, obscuring her features entirely. The material was delicate, translucent enough to hint at the shape of her face, but concealing her identity nonetheless. His stomach twisted with irritation. This was ridiculous. Evelyn stood composed, a graceful enigma amidst the curious stares. As she reached him, Alexander forced a smile and extended his hand. "Evelyn, I presume?" "Alexander," she responded, her voice smooth, controlled. "A pleasure," he said, the words dripping with sarcasm. He leaned in slightly. "Is the veil some kind of joke? Or do you just enjoy the mystery?" Evelyn did not flinch. "Neither. It is simply my choice." His jaw clenched. "Right. Because that's normal." "Is it so abnormal to want to be seen for something other than my face?" she countered, her tone calm but firm. "After all, this marriage is a business transaction, is it not? What I look like shouldn't matter." Her words stung more than he expected. She was right, of course. He hadn't even considered her as a person, only as an obligation. The evening proceeded in a blur. Toasts were made, hands were shaken, and behind the mask of pleasantries, Alexander simmered with resentment. Evelyn, however, remained composed, her posture unyielding, her veil untouched. Later that night, when the celebrations had died down, Alexander found himself pacing the vast balcony of the estate, the city lights sprawling beneath him. He had married a ghost, a woman who refused to be seen. It was infuriating. "Is the view to your liking?" Evelyn's voice interrupted his brooding. He turned sharply. She stood a few feet away, her veil reflecting the moonlight. "What are you doing out here?" "I thought I should get to know my husband." He huffed. "You want to get to know me, but you won't even show me your face." Evelyn sighed. "If my face is all you seek, perhaps you're looking for the wrong things." His fists clenched. "What exactly are you hiding?" She tilted her head slightly, regarding him carefully. "Does it matter? You agreed to this marriage for the same reason I did, our family's benefit." Why should my appearance change anything? Alexander had no answer. He wanted to lash out, to demand an explanation, but he held back. Instead, he exhaled heavily and turned away, staring at the city below. Fine. Keep your secrets. But don't expect me to pretend this is anything more than a contract. Evelyn nodded, unshaken. Agreed. Yet, as she walked away, Alexander couldn't shake the nagging feeling that beneath that veil lay something far more complicated than a mere secret. And for reasons he couldn't quite grasp, he found himself wanting to know what it was. The morning after their engagement party, Alexander awoke to the sound of distant murmurs. He groggily made his way to the dining room, where he found his parents engaged in quiet but urgent discussion. Evelyn sat across from them, poised, as if unaffected by the tension in the air. "What's going on?" Alexander asked, rubbing his temple. His mother hesitated before answering. "There's been an issue with the merger." Evelyn spoke before Charles could. "Your father made a miscalculation in the contract. A clause was overlooked, and if not rectified, it could cost your company millions." Alexander blinked, then scoffed. "And you know this how?" Evelyn's gaze was unwavering. "Because I read the contract." Alexander glanced at his father, who confirmed the statement with a tight nod. "She caught the mistake last night and brought it to my attention," Charles admitted. "We're lucky she did. Had we signed as is, we would have been at a severe disadvantage." Alexander felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. A mixture of surprise and something close to admiration. He shook it off. "Impressive," he said begrudgingly. "But that doesn't change anything." Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "I never expected it to." Yet, as she turned her attention back to the business at hand, Alexander found himself watching her in a new light. His frustration with the veil remained, but for the first time, he began to wonder if what lay beneath it wasn't a secret, but a challenge. The following weeks were a whirlwind of negotiations, formal events, and strategic business meetings. Alexander remained cold and distant toward Evelyn, still bitter over the forced marriage and the enigma of her ever-present veil. Yet, as time passed, he could not deny the impact she was making. At first, Alexander was determined to ignore her. He kept their interactions brief and professional, dismissing her presence as an unfortunate necessity. But Evelyn was not content with being a mere bystander. She observed everything, quietly absorbing the nuances of the company and the people within it. One afternoon, during an executive board meeting, Evelyn unexpectedly spoke up. The room had been stuck in a heated debate over a failing acquisition, the executives unable to reach a consensus. Alexander watched in silent intrigue as his veiled wife calmly laid out an alternative strategy, one that neither he nor his team had considered. "If you restructure the acquisition model to a profit-sharing agreement rather than an outright buyout, you alleviate both financial risk and resistance from the shareholders," she explained, her voice steady and assured. "This gives the smaller company an incentive to grow while still aligning with Caldwell Industries' vision." The room fell silent. Alexander studied her, his fingers steepled together. He had expected his wife to be a mere accessory to the business, a token in the grand scheme of corporate alliances. But she had just outmaneuvered some of the sharpest minds in the room with one suggestion. "We'll look into it," Alexander finally said, his voice measured. The executives, though initially skeptical, nodded in agreement. That evening, Alexander found himself watching Evelyn more closely. He noticed the way she carried herself, graceful yet deliberate, always listening, always thinking. She was not the timid, passive bride he had assumed her to be. She was calculating, intelligent, and undeniably competent. Despite himself, he was intrigued. As their business interactions increased, so did their ones. One evening, after an exhausting meeting, Alexander found Evelyn in the library of their estate. She was reading through company reports, a cup of tea resting on the mahogany desk beside her. Without thinking, he spoke. "You're quite the strategist." Evelyn looked up, her eyes unreadable behind the delicate veil. "I've always been interested in business. Why didn't you say anything before?" Would you have listened? Alexander hesitated. He knew the answer. Evelyn sighed and closed the report. I understand why you resent this marriage. But I am not your enemy, Alexander. He frowned. Then why the secrecy? Why the veil? She was silent for a long moment before finally responding. Because I want to be seen for my mind, not my face. If I had entered this marriage as a woman judged on appearances alone, would you have respected me? Alexander opened his mouth to argue but found that he had no words. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander could no longer deny his growing admiration for Evelyn. He found himself seeking her input more often, valuing her insight. She had an uncanny ability to read people, to see opportunities where others saw obstacles. It was not just her intelligence that captivated him, it was her quiet strength. One evening, they attended a high-profile gala, a crucial event for sealing a multi-million-dollar deal. As always, Evelyn wore her veil, sparking curiosity and whispers among the elite attendees. Alexander, however, found himself unconcerned with the stares of others. Instead, he found himself standing beside her, speaking to her as a partner, rather than a stranger forced into his life. Throughout the night, she effortlessly navigated conversations, subtly influencing negotiations with a tact that even Alexander found impressive. By the time the evening ended, their company had secured the deal. Later that night, as they rode home in the limousine, Alexander turned to her. I don't understand you, Evelyn. She tilted her head slightly. Is that a bad thing? He sighed. No. Just unexpected. Evelyn was silent for a moment before softly saying, maybe it's time you stop trying to understand me through what you see, and start understanding me through what I do. Something shifted in Alexander that night. He still did not see her face. But for the first time, he saw her. Alexander found himself in his office late at night, staring at the city skyline. His mind was troubled, caught between old prejudices and new realizations. Evelyn had become an undeniable presence in his life, not just as his wife, but as an equal. Her intelligence, her unwavering strength, and her ability to see beyond the obvious had left him both impressed and unsettled. He was no longer the man who scoffed at their marriage, but he wasn't sure what he had become either. The door creaked open, and Evelyn stepped in, her silhouette illuminated by the dim light of the office lamp. She was dressed in her usual elegance, the veil still in place, but Alexander barely noticed it anymore. You're working late, she observed, moving toward him. Couldn't sleep, he admitted. Evelyn hesitated before speaking. I suppose that makes two of us. Alexander turned to face her fully. Evelyn, I need to ask you something. She nodded, waiting. Why me? He asked. Why agree to this marriage? You had a choice, didn't you? Evelyn took a slow breath before answering. Yes. And I chose this because I saw potential, not just in the business arrangement, but in you. I knew you wouldn't accept me easily, and I knew it would take time for you to see me for who I am. But I also knew that beneath your resentment, there was a man capable of looking beyond the surface. Alexander scoffed, though there was no real bitterness in his tone. You gave me too much credit. No, she said firmly. I gave you exactly what you deserved. A chance. Something shifted between them in that moment. It was no longer just a battle of wits or a clash of two strangers forced into an unwanted marriage. It was something deeper, an understanding that neither had expected. The real turning point came a week later. Alexander had been called into an emergency board meeting. A Maxwell company had launched an aggressive takeover attempt on one of their subsidiary firms, threatening everything his family had worked to secure. The board was in chaos, executives throwing out half-baked solutions, none of which had a real chance of working. Then, Evelyn spoke. May I offer a suggestion? Every head turned toward her, some skeptical, others merely curious. Alexander, however, leaned forward, his full attention on her. She laid out a counter-strategy, one that would not only block the takeover but put Caldwell Industries in a position of dominance. Her approach was bold, calculated, and left no room for failure. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Alexander studied the faces of the executives, some reluctant to accept a strategy from an outsider, let alone his wife. But he saw what they refused to admit: she was right. Without hesitation, he stood up. "We go with Evelyn's plan," he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. Murmurs rippled through the room, but no one dared challenge him. Later, as they left the meeting, Alexander stopped Evelyn in the hallway. "You just saved this company." Evelyn met his gaze. "It was never about saving the company. It was about proving that I could." Alexander exhaled, a slow smile forming. "You proved more than that." For the first time since their marriage, Alexander didn't just admire Evelyn, he respected her. And perhaps, for the first time, he truly saw her. The tension between Alexander and Evelyn had been steadily building, their relationship evolving from cold indifference to a deep, unspoken connection. But the veil remained, a symbol of the final wall between them. And Alexander, for all his newfound admiration and respect, could not shake the need to see her, to know the truth that she guarded so closely. It all came to a head one stormy evening. Alexander arrived home late, the echo of rain hammering against the estate's windows. He was exhausted from a day of high-stakes negotiations, yet his mind was consumed by a single thought: Evelyn. She had become a constant presence in his life, not just in business, but in his thoughts, his decisions, his desires. And yet, the veil still separated them. As he walked through the dimly lit corridors, he heard music drifting from the drawing room. Intrigued, he followed the sound, his heart quickening. He found Evelyn seated at the grand piano, her fingers dancing over the keys, lost in a melody that was both haunting and beautiful. He watched her in silence, the flickering candlelight casting shadows over her delicate form. The sight stirred something deep within him. This woman, who had entered his life as an obligation, had become so much more. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Evelyn." She stopped playing, her hands resting on the keys. Slowly, she turned to face him. Alexander took a deep breath, his voice steady but intense. "Why won't you let me see you?" Evelyn's posture stiffened, and for the first time, he saw hesitation in her. "Alexander, do you still not trust me?" he asked, stepping closer. "After everything? After all we've built together?" "It's not about trust," she said softly. "It's about what you will see." He frowned. "You think I care about your appearance?" "I think everyone does," she whispered. "Even when they don't want to." Alexander ran a frustrated hand through his hair. "Evelyn, I fell for you without ever seeing your face. I fell for your mind, your strength, your heart. What else matters?" She searched his eyes for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then, she rose from the piano bench, her hands trembling slightly. "If you truly mean that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "then you must understand why this moment terrifies me." Alexander stepped even closer, until he was just inches away. "Then let me prove to you that you don't have to be afraid." A thick silence settled between them, the air charged with anticipation. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Evelyn reached up. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of her veil. Alexander held his breath as she hesitated, then finally, lifted it away. The world seemed to still. For a heartbeat, Alexander could only stare, his expression unreadable. Evelyn stood before him, vulnerable, her face fully revealed for the first time. She was breathtaking. Not in the conventional way, her features were not the kind that graced magazine covers or fashion spreads. But there was something undeniably striking about her. Her eyes, deep and knowing. Her lips, soft yet resolute. A faint scar traced the side of her cheek, a mark of a past untold, a story left unspoken. And yet, it was beautiful in its own right, just as she was. Evelyn waited, bracing for his reaction. Alexander exhaled slowly, his gaze unwavering. Then, with infinite care, he reached up and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing against her scar. "This," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "is what you thought I wouldn't accept?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "I've been judged for it before." Alexander shook his head. "Then they were fools." She searched his face for any trace of pity, any flicker of disappointment. She found none. Only warmth. Only admiration. "You are," he said softly, "the most extraordinary woman I have ever known." Evelyn's breath hitched. And then, for the first time since their marriage, she truly smiled. The storm raged outside, but within the estate, a different storm had settled, one of walls crumbling, barriers dissolving, and hearts finally laid bare. In that moment, Alexander Caldwell knew he had not only found his wife, he had found his home. And he would never let her go. In the days following Evelyn's unveiling, the air between her and Alexander shifted. The unspoken tension that had once lingered like an ever-present shadow was gone. In its place, there was something deeper, a mutual understanding that transcended words. Alexander had expected some lingering awkwardness, some period of adjustment after the momentous reveal. But there was none. Instead, their bond only deepened. He found himself watching her in a different way, not out of curiosity, but out of admiration for the woman she had always been. The veil had never truly hidden her. It had only emphasized what was most important, her intelligence, her kindness, and the unwavering strength that had drawn him in from the very beginning. One evening, as they sat in the garden, Alexander reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Showing me?" Evelyn steadied their entwined hands before shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "For the first time, I feel free." The weight of her words settled between them, and Alexander squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Then I'm honored." Word of Evelyn's revelation spread through their social circles with the speed of wildfire. The business elite, who had once speculated and whispered about the veiled bride, were now eager to understand the woman behind the mystery. But Evelyn remained as composed as ever, handling every question and every lingering stare with the same quiet confidence she always had. At the next board meeting, she walked into the conference room without the veil, her presence commanding respect. The executives, who had previously underestimated her, now saw her in a different light. Not because of her face, but because of the woman they had come to know, one who had shaped the company's trajectory with intelligence and unwavering determination. Alexander watched with pride as Evelyn led the discussion, her insights proving invaluable. When she finished speaking, he leaned over and whispered, "You know, I think they fear you more than they ever feared me." Evelyn smirked. Good. They should. Their marriage, once a mere arrangement of convenience, had evolved into a partnership built on trust, respect, and something deeper. Love. It was not the love of fleeting passion, but the kind that grew strong, fortified by trials and triumphs alike. At home, their dynamic had shifted as well. The small moments, the ones Alexander had once overlooked, became the foundation of their relationship. Shared meals, late-night conversations, quiet laughter over books in the library. He no longer sought to understand Evelyn through the lens of mystery. Instead, he cherished every piece of her she chose to share. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, Alexander turned to her. "Marry me." Evelyn arched an amused brow. "We're already married." He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, I mean truly. Marry me not because our families arranged it. Not because of business. But because you want to." Evelyn's expression softened. "And if I say yes? Then I will spend the rest of my life proving that it was the best decision you ever made." A slow smile spread across her lips. "Then yes, Alexander. I'll marry you." And for the first time since their union began, they sealed their promise with a kiss, not as strangers bound by duty, but as partners who had chosen each other against all odds. The morning sun filtered through the grand windows of their estate, casting a golden glow over the room where Alexander and Evelyn sat, side by side, at the long mahogany table. The air between them was no longer fraught with hesitation or doubt. It was warm, filled with a silent understanding that had been built piece by piece, moment by moment. Evelyn's unveiled face was no longer a subject of curiosity or apprehension. It was simply her, strong, intelligent, and radiant. And Alexander, who once resented their marriage as a mere business transaction, now looked at her with a kind of reverence he never thought possible. Their bond had deepened beyond what either of them had anticipated. They had built something neither of them had planned for, a true partnership, both in life and in business. With the recent merger secured, they had become an undeniable force in the corporate world, admired and respected. But beyond that, they had found something far more valuable: love, trust, and a shared future. Evelyn closed a portfolio of financial reports, turning to Alexander with an amused smile. "I believe you owe me a dinner," she said, raising an eyebrow. Alexander leaned back, feigning confusion. "Do I?" "You do," she confirmed. "You promised that if the deal went through, you would take me anywhere I wanted." Alexander smirked, reaching for her hand. "And where does my brilliant wife want to go?" Evelyn tapped a finger to her chin, pretending to ponder. "Somewhere simple. Somewhere quiet." He chuckled. "You, the woman who just negotiated $1 million acquisition, want something simple?" She nodded, her eyes filled with something softer than victory, contentment. "We've spent so much time proving things to others. I just want a moment that belongs to us." Alexander squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. "Then that's what we'll have." As the day stretched on, preparations for a celebratory gala buzzed through their household. Business partners and family members would soon arrive, eager to acknowledge their success. But amid the grandeur and the champagne toasts, the real triumph was the quiet certainty they had found in each other. That evening, as they stood together before their assembled guests, Alexander took the microphone and glanced at Evelyn, a playful glint in his eyes. "Many of you know that this partnership started as an arranged marriage," he began, pausing as murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "And if I'm being honest, I wasn't particularly thrilled about it." A few chuckles rang out, but Alexander's expression turned earnest. "But what I didn't realize then was that the best things in life aren't always the ones we choose, they're the ones that choose us." He turned fully to Evelyn. "I stand here tonight not just as a businessman, not just as someone who secured a deal, but as a man who found something much rarer. I found a partner, an equal, and the love of my life." The room erupted in applause, but all Alexander could see was Evelyn, the woman who had turned his world upside down in the most unexpected, beautiful way. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "There was a time when I thought I had to hide behind my veil to be seen for who I truly was," she admitted. "But I've learned that love isn't about hiding. It's about being seen completely and still being chosen." Alexander reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. "Always." As the guests cheered, Alexander leaned in and whispered against her ear, "Now, about that simple, quiet dinner." Evelyn laughed, tilting her head to meet his gaze. "Let's go." And so, as the night stretched on, amid celebrations and success, Alexander and Evelyn slipped away, not to a grand, extravagant event, but to a quiet little restaurant on the outskirts of the city. A place where they could simply be themselves, together. Because, in the end, that was all that truly mattered.